The days that followed my escape stretched like soft fabric, thin, fragile, but warm. Every morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains of that small North Carolina cottage. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up to duty, or orders, or silence heavy with resentment. I woke up for myself. Marla came by almost every day. Sometimes she brought muffins, other times she brought nothing but her company, which was gift enough. We'd sit outside on the porch, sipping tea, listening to the cicadas hum. I could almost pretend I'd always lived there, that I hadn't once belonged to a house full of unspoken pain. But at night, the dreams came. In them, I was back in the old kitchen, hearing David's voice echoing from another room, "You're ruining everything, Mom." His tone wasn't angry this time. It was young, confused, like a child who didn't understand what he'd broken. I'd wake up with tears on my pillow, whispering into the dark, "You did this to yourself." Meanwhile, somewhere far behind me, David was unraveling. A mutual acquaintance, an old friend from the neighborhood who still called Marla from time to time, told her that David had been seen wandering around the house late at night. He'd stopped going to work regularly, and he'd started drinking. Not the loud, violent kind, but the slow, collapsing kind. He called me dozens of times, they said. Then hundreds. He even called Marla once, but she didn't answer. She didn't have to. When she told me, I didn't feel triumph. Just a deep, quiet ache. I hadn't left to punish him. I'd left because staying would have finished me. Still, I couldn't help but imagine him, sitting in that lifeless house, looking around and realizing that every bit of warmth he'd ever known had walked out the door. Sometimes, justice isn't loud. It's silent. One evening, as Marla and I were watching the sun go down, she said, "You know, he's probably going through hell." I nodded. So was I. She gave me a long look, her eyes full of both understanding and sorrow. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, Marla. He can have peace when he learns what love really costs." She didn't argue. She just reached out and took my hand. Later that night, I sat alone with my thoughts. I took out a notebook Marla had bought me and began to write. Not to him, not yet, but to myself. I wrote about the bakery where I used to work. About Robert's laughter echoing in the hall. About the smell of rain on the day David was born. I wrote until my fingers cramped, because for so long I had been silent, and now, words were the only way to set myself free. The next morning, I placed a potted plant on the porch, an ivy with small, bright green leaves. It reminded me of the life I was finally growing for myself. I touched the leaves gently and whispered, "You're going to be fine here." "So am I." It felt strange, saying it out loud, believing it. But as I stood there, watching the sunrise cast gold across the trees, I realized something. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of David, not of being alone, not of starting over. Still, peace can never truly rest when ghosts are awake, and miles away, my son was beginning to cross lines no mother ever thought her child would. Weeks passed before I allowed myself to believe I was truly safe. Every morning, I opened the curtains, half expecting to see David's car parked outside, his silhouette standing in the doorway, his voice calling my name in that cold, clipped way of his. But the road was always empty. The silence stayed kind. I began to live in small ways again, walking to the farmer's market, learning the names of flowers, talking to Marla's cousin, Nora, who rented the cottage to me. She was a kind woman, quiet but observant, and she never pried. She just smiled and said, "You look like someone who finally exhaled after years of holding her breath." And she was right. I had. Still, freedom has its ghosts. Sometimes at night, I'd hear a car engine far off in the hills and my chest would tighten, convinced it was him. I'd freeze by the window until the sound faded away. Other nights, I'd dream of the house, not the walls or rooms, but the emptiness that must have grown there without me. What I didn't know was that miles away, David had fallen into that emptiness completely. He'd started calling old neighbors, pretending to be worried. He visited banks, questioned realtors, even drove around nearby towns looking for me. When that failed, he began drinking more heavily. He stopped shaving. His house, once spotless, became suffocating with dust and stale air. He'd wake up at odd hours, convinced he'd heard my footsteps downstairs, but of course, there was nothing there. He even called my old notary, Mrs. Carter, demanding information. She told him coldly, "Your mother was a smart woman, David. If she didn't want to be found, you won't find her." Those words sent him spiraling. He began searching records online, digging through property databases, desperate to track my name. But all he found were roadblocks, because my life no longer existed under Helen Price. Back in Asheville, I began to write again, this time letters I would never send. Letters to David. Letters to Robert. Letters to the younger version of myself who thought love meant servitude. One afternoon, as I wrote by the window, Marla arrived with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "For you," she said, smiling. Inside was a soft blue dress, simple, airy, beautiful. "I saw it in town and thought, that's Helen's color," she said. I hadn't worn something new in years. For a long moment, I just stared at it, unsure whether I had the right to accept beauty again. But Marla wouldn't let me refuse. That evening, I put it on. I stood in front of the mirror, half afraid I wouldn't recognize the woman staring back, but I did. For the first time, she looked alive. I went outside and let the evening wind play with the fabric. The world felt wider, and I could almost hear my younger self whispering, "You made it out." Later that night, as I poured tea, Marla looked at me across the table. "You know, you're not just someone's mother anymore. You're you." Her words landed softly, but they stayed. Because I finally understood what she meant. I had spent decades being needed, used, dismissed, and ignored, and now, for the first time, I was simply Helen. Somewhere far away, the man I raised was breaking under the weight of his own choices. And I didn't know where my feet were taking me until I found myself at the end of the block, standing in front of a small white house with blue shutters. Marla Hayes lived there. We'd spoken in passing for years, polite greetings at the market, the occasional wave across the street. She'd cared for her sick mother until the very end, and there was a quiet strength in her that I always admired. The kind of woman who didn't need to announce her kindness, it lived in the way she listened. I hesitated before knocking. What was I even going to say? My son wants to lock me away? The thought sounded absurd, almost shameful. But before I could turn back, the door opened, and there she was, hair pulled into a messy braid, apron dusted with flour, hands warm and real. "Helen," she said with gentle surprise, "it's been a while. Come in, come in." I tried to smile, but my lips betrayed me. I just needed someone to talk to. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, guided me inside, and poured 2 cups of coffee. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and baked bread, the kind of smell that feels like safety. And then I told her everything. Every word David had said. Every look that made me feel smaller. Every quiet humiliation I'd swallowed for the sake of keeping peace. It spilled out like water from a cracked jug, unstoppable, messy, raw. Marla didn't interrupt. She didn't pity me, either. She just listened, her eyes soft but steady, her hand resting lightly on mine. When I finally ran out of words, she said something that cut through the fog like sunlight through glass. "You're not crazy, Helen. You're just tired of being erased." That single sentence shattered something inside me, the part of me that still believed this was all my fault. For the first time in months, I cried. Not quietly, not politely, but deeply, the way you cry when grief and anger finally shake hands. Marla stayed beside me, not speaking, just letting me fall apart without judgment. When I could finally breathe again, she said softly, "You don't have to stay, you know. If you ever decide to leave, I'll help you." I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Leave? You mean?" "Yes," she said firmly. "If he wants to cage you, then you build yourself a door." Her words sank deep into me like a promise. That night, as I walked home, something inside me had changed. I stood a little straighter. My steps were lighter. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a trap, it felt like a challenge. David noticed the change immediately. When he came home and saw me humming quietly while folding laundry, his brow furrowed. "You're in a good mood," he said suspiciously. I just smiled. "Maybe I am." He looked puzzled, even uneasy. "Good. Let him wonder. Let him feel the uncertainty that had lived in me for so long. Because by the time David discovered what I was planning, I wouldn't just be gone, I'd be free, and he'd never see it coming." After that morning with Marla, the world didn't look the same. The walls of my house still held shadows, but they no longer scared me, they reminded me what I was escaping from. Marla became my quiet anchor. She started visiting often, always under the harmless excuse of bringing over bread or checking on the garden. To anyone else, it looked like two old friends sharing coffee. But behind our small talk, every word carried weight. Every visit was a step closer to freedom. We planned in whispers, like two conspirators hiding in plain sight. It began with simple questions. "Do you have any savings? Where are your documents? Can you access your account without him knowing?" I told her about the small envelopes of money I'd hidden, the duplicate deed Evelyn had kept safe, and the new account I'd opened under H.L. Price. Marla's eyes glimmered with approval. "Good," she said. "Then you already have one foot out the door." The next question was harder. "Where will you go?" I hadn't thought that far. I'd been so focused on surviving the present that the idea of a future felt foreign. "Anywhere," I said softly. "Anywhere he can't find me." Marla nodded. "I might have an idea." She told me about her cousin who lived in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet place with mountains and markets, where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. "She rents a little house out back," Marla said. "I can talk to her. It's nothing fancy, but it's peaceful." Peaceful. The word sounded like a prayer I'd forgotten how to say. That night, I couldn't sleep, but for the first time, it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was possibility. The idea that I could still choose my own life, even at my age, even after everything. Days passed quietly. David grew more impatient, snapping at small things, spending more time away from home. He thought I was wilting, he didn't realize I was blooming beneath his neglect. Meanwhile, Marla and I moved like clockwork. She brought me a sturdy suitcase for when the time comes. I began gathering the essentials, my documents, cash, birth certificate, a few family photos that still brought me peace. Everything went into a tin cookie box I hid beneath the false bottom of my dresser. Every time I looked at it, I felt stronger. One afternoon, while we sat in Marla's kitchen kneading dough, she looked at me seriously. "If we're going to do this, Helen, it has to be soon. Before he takes legal steps you can't undo." I nodded. I'd already made up my mind. We decided on a Friday, the day David had his regular meeting with his lawyer, the perfect window. Marla would drive her old beige sedan around the back road behind my house. I'd leave with one suitcase, nothing more. Everything else, the furniture, the memories, the ghosts, would stay behind. I started selling small things, an heirloom vase, a few old figurines, the silver cutlery my mother gave me. Each sale felt like cutting a string that had tied me to this house. I was lightening my load, piece by piece. But something in David's behavior began to shift. He'd walk into my room without knocking, pretending to look for his keys or a file. His eyes would wander over my dresser, my shelves, searching. He didn't know what he was looking for, but I could feel his suspicion growing. So I became even more careful. I memorized where every item was placed. I took photos with my old phone in case anything moved. This wasn't just preparation anymore, it was survival. One evening, as Marla dropped me off, she said quietly, "Don't wait too long, Helen. Some cages don't give second chances." He stood by the dining room window, arms crossed, his jaw set like stone, watching me, waiting for me to break. Maybe he thought I'd start sobbing or beg him to reconsider. But I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, this man who used to cling to my robe when he had nightmares, now staring at me as if I were a stranger trespassing in his life. It's strange how love can cool down so quietly. One day, you're someone's whole world, the next, you're just another thing that needs dealing with. Helen, he said flatly, I can't keep doing this. You're making things harder for everyone. Marissa's tired. I'm tired. It's not a life for anyone. His tone wasn't angry, that would have been easier to bear. It was calm, measured, practical. The kind of calm that hurts worse than shouting because it means the decision's already made. He kept talking, something about an opening at a nice place, and how he'd take care of everything. It would all be settled in 2 days. That's how long it takes to erase a mother, 2 days. I didn't answer. My lips felt heavy, like any word might spill my soul onto the floor. So instead, I walked to the kitchen, boiled water, and brewed myself a cup of coffee. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the strength it took not to crumble. Through the thin walls, I could hear him talking on the phone, cheerful now, relieved, as if getting rid of me was a task finally checked off his list. When he finished, he came into the kitchen. I asked him quietly, would you like some dinner, David? He looked startled, maybe even guilty. Perhaps he expected me to lash out or cry. But I didn't give him that satisfaction. I just stared into my cup and took another sip. He left without answering. That night, I sat in my room with the door shut, the walls pressing in close, and the silence louder than anything I'd ever known. My mind wandered through years, the nights I stayed awake beside his hospital bed, the birthdays I spent baking cakes I couldn't afford, the mornings I left early to work extra hours so he'd have shoes like the other kids. And now, he wanted to place me like old furniture. But somewhere between the ache in my chest and the sound of his car pulling away, a decision began to take root. If someone was going to decide my future, it wouldn't be my son, it would be me. He doesn't remember who I was before I became his mother. He doesn't know that this house, the same one he now claims as his, was built brick by brick with my hands, my wages, my sacrifices. I wasn't born fragile. I've rebuilt myself before. I can do it again. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting every breath as if each one were a promise that I wasn't done yet. By morning, I was calm. I made breakfast as always. David came downstairs with his usual detached expression, said he had errands to run, and that we'd talk later. I smiled. Of course, I said softly. When the door closed behind him, I opened my closet and pulled out a small wooden box, my life inside it. Papers, savings, letters, proof that I still had choices. He thought I was helpless. But he was wrong. The game had just begun, and this time, the one moving the pieces would be me. He doesn't know it yet, but in exactly 7 days, his mother will vanish, and when she does, she'll take everything he thought he owned with her. I remember the day David was born as vividly as the lines on my own palms. The nurse said he came into this world with his fists clenched and his lungs wide open, like a tiny general declaring war on the quiet. I thought that cry meant strength. Now I know it was something else, a warning, perhaps. Even as a child, David never cried from hunger or pain. He cried from wanting. If another child had a toy, he wanted it too, not because he needed it, but because it wasn't his yet. And I, with the blind love of a young mother, mistook his demands for drive. I told myself I was raising a boy who knew what he wanted. I gave him everything I could, and plenty I couldn't. I sewed clothes late into the night just to buy him the sneakers all the other kids at school wore. I skipped meals so his lunchbox would never look empty. I told myself I was shaping a good life for him, not realizing I was teaching him that love meant sacrifice, mine. When Robert, my husband, passed away, David was just 15. He didn't cry at the funeral. He stood beside me, stoic, expressionless, as if emotions were beneath him. That night, when I couldn't stop crying, he said, "Mom, stop it. People die." He had to die of something. I remember staring at him, waiting for remorse that never came. That's when the distance began, slow, quiet, creeping like frost. He stopped asking where I was going or how I was doing. He ate dinner in silence, barely looking at me. I told myself it was grief. That he was coping his own way. But in truth, it wasn't grief, it was the first sign that my son no longer saw me as a mother. He saw me as a relic. Years passed. David grew into a successful man, well-dressed, well-spoken, and utterly hollow inside. He moved to the city, got a good job, a polished wife, and a sterile apartment. I stayed in this house Robert and I built brick by brick, the one we bought when hope was all we could afford. At first, I thought success might soften David. That he'd call, maybe visit, bring flowers like he used to. But his visits grew shorter, his calls rarer. He'd walk in with his phone glued to his hand, say hello, drink his coffee, and leave before it cooled. One afternoon, he looked around the house, not admiringly, not nostalgically, but calculatingly, like a man assessing property value. Then he said, "Mom, maybe it's time you think about selling this place. It's too much for you alone." He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. Maybe that was mercy, maybe even he couldn't look at me while twisting the knife. After that, it began. The pressure. The constant phone calls. "Mom, I have a friend in real estate." "Mom, this house is too old." "Mom, it's for your own good." Every word was wrapped in concern, but underneath was hunger, greed wearing a polite smile. Each time I hung up the phone, I felt another thread of me unravel. I'd walk through the house, touching the walls, whispering to the memories like they were old friends I was afraid to lose. Then, one afternoon, David came to visit again, suit pressed, tie straight, the smell of expensive cologne masking his decay. He stood by the rose bushes and said flatly, "If you don't sign, I'll be forced to take other measures. This house will be mine, Mom, whether you like it or not." That's when something inside me shifted, not broke, but hardened. I realized that the boy I had loved with every breath was gone. In his place stood a man who thought he could own me like a deed. But he was wrong. That night, I opened my old ledger, and what I found inside would become the first weapon in the quiet war I was about to begin. That night, I couldn't sleep. My heart was too full of thoughts that refused to rest. So I pulled out the old brown ledger I kept since Robert's death, the one filled with neat handwriting, faded ink, and years of sacrifice disguised as numbers. I sat on my bed, the house quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I began flipping through the pages. Each line was a wound. David's school tuition. His braces. His college fund. The countless doctor visits for his childhood asthma. Every dollar I'd ever earned had found its way into his life. And as I traced each entry with my finger, I realized, my love had been measurable, but his gratitude was not. I closed the book slowly, the weight of it pressing on my lap. The truth was sharp and heavy, my son didn't love me. He only loved what I had. The next morning, I looked at the house differently. Not as a burden, but as proof of everything I had endured, and everything he would never take from me. The bricks, the cracks in the walls, even the fading paint, they were mine. Each one a scar earned through survival. So, I made a decision. If David wanted this house, he would have to fight for it, and I wasn't planning to lose. I started small. I gathered every document I could find, deeds, tax papers, receipts, insurance slips. I stored them neatly in the wooden box under my bed, the same one I'd opened the day before. Then I made an appointment with someone I hadn't seen in years, Evelyn Carter, the retired notary who used to handle paperwork for Robert's Bakery. She still lived 2 blocks down, a quiet widow with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with a slow, knowing smile. "Well, Helen Price," she said, "it's been a long time. What brings you to my doorstep?" "Old ghosts," I replied. "And new battles." She poured tea and listened as I explained everything: David's visits, his pressure, his threats about the facility. She didn't interrupt, not once. When I finished, she leaned back and nodded. "You did right coming here. Men like that forget who raised them. You protect what's yours, Helen." Her words didn't erase the pain, but they planted courage where fear had lived. That evening, I walked home lighter, the sun dipping low behind the oak trees. The neighborhood looked the same: children playing, sprinklers hissing, dogs barking, but I was not the same woman. I was preparing for something. A quiet war. I spent the next few days putting my house in order, not to leave it, but to defend it. I hid important papers in odd places, between old cookbooks, inside empty flour tins, beneath a loose floorboard under my dresser. I even made photocopies of everything and left them with Evelyn for safekeeping. David didn't call that week. Maybe he thought silence would make me anxious. Maybe he believed I'd cave. But his silence gave me strength. It gave me time. And when he finally did show up again, sharp suit, cold smile, he didn't know that while he was plotting my removal, I was building my defense. He walked in, loosened his tie, and said, "Mom, I've already made the arrangements. You're going to that facility next month. It's final." I looked him dead in the eye. "You've mistaken silence for weakness, David." For a moment, his smirk faltered. He didn't understand what I meant, not yet. But he would. Because by the time my son tried to take everything from me, I'd already made sure that without my consent, he couldn't claim a single brick. That night after David's visit, I couldn't stop pacing the hallway. The shadows of the house stretched long and thin across the walls, like old memories trying to whisper warnings. How did we get here? When did the child who used to fall asleep in my arms become the man who looked at me like I was a burden to dispose of? The clock ticked, patient and cruel. I stopped in front of the mirror at the end of the hall. My reflection looked older, yes, but not defeated. My eyes still held fire. And that's when I realized something simple but powerful: if David thought I was fragile, that was my advantage. I'd spent years keeping records, handling bills, balancing ledgers, all the quiet, invisible work that made life possible. David never noticed, never asked how things got done. He assumed everything just appeared. That arrogance would be his weakness. The next morning, I started moving carefully, deliberately. I cleaned out drawers and cabinets under the excuse of spring cleaning. I separated what was mine from what could be left behind. I found old jewelry boxes, silverware from my mother, small valuables that still held meaning and value. I sold a few things discreetly to an antique dealer 2 towns over. He paid in cash, no questions asked. Each dollar I folded into a small envelope, marking the corner with a single dot of blue ink. My emergency fund. I also went to the bank, not my usual branch, but a smaller one on the outskirts of town. I opened a new account under a variation of my name, H.L. Price. No joint holders, no shared access. The young clerk didn't know who I was, and I liked it that way. That night, David came home later than usual. He looked exhausted, annoyed, already half somewhere else. "You didn't cook?" he asked when he saw the empty counter. "No," I said calmly. "I wasn't hungry." He frowned but didn't push it. Maybe he thought I was sulking. Maybe he thought guilt would do the work for him. Either way, I stayed quiet, because silence is stronger than any scream when it's chosen, not forced. Days passed, and my preparations continued. I gathered documents, made duplicates, memorized where everything was hidden. I even wrote down contact numbers on slips of paper that I hid in books: insurance, medical, legal, just in case. David had no idea that while he was planning my confinement, I was planning my escape. Then one evening, I overheard him talking outside on the phone. He was pacing near the porch, his voice sharp, confident, the voice he used when he thought he was in control. "Yeah, she doesn't argue anymore," he said. "Just keeps to herself. We'll finalize everything next week. I'll start renovations after she's moved out. I froze. Renovations. He was already speaking as if the house was his. The word renovations echoed in my head all night like thunder. That was when I knew, it wasn't about care, or exhaustion, or his wife's complaints. It was about ownership. Greed had swallowed whatever love was left. By morning, I was done hoping he'd change. I had stopped praying for understanding. My only prayer now was for strength. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and sat by the window, watching the sunlight crawl across the garden. Every flower, every leaf, every shadow was part of the life I'd built, and I wasn't about to surrender it. He thought this was checkmate. But he didn't know the board had changed. In just a few days, David would realize that the mother he thought was powerless had just turned his entire game upside down, and he wouldn't even see it coming. It was a Tuesday morning when I decided I couldn't face another silent breakfast alone. The air in the house felt heavy, almost accusing. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock seemed to echo louder, as if reminding me that time was running out. So, I put on my old cardigan, brushed my hair into a bun, and stepped outside. The world looked deceptively ordinary, children walking to school, a mailman whistling, dogs barking behind fences. Yet everything inside me was trembling. I stood in my doorway long after she left, her words echoing in the stillness. Because if David's suspicion turned into action before Friday came, I knew my freedom might vanish before I could. The next few days felt like walking on glass, silent, sharp, and ready to cut at any wrong step. David had become restless. His polite mask was slipping. The same man who once claimed he was just tired now hovered around me like a warden counting the hours before a prisoner's transfer. He'd stop me in the hallway for no reason. "What are you doing with those papers? Why is this drawer open? Have you been to the bank recently?" His questions were casual on the surface, but his eyes betrayed him, always searching, measuring, doubting. One evening, he stood by my door holding a receipt he'd found on the kitchen counter. It was from the antique shop where I'd sold a small porcelain figure. "What's this?" he asked, his voice calm but tight. My heart skipped, but my face didn't show it. "An old thing I found in the attic. I thought it might be worth something." He stared at me a moment too long. "You should have told me." "Why?" I asked. "It wasn't yours." He blinked, taken aback by my tone. He wasn't used to defiance. Then, without another word, he dropped the receipt on the counter and walked out. But I knew what that silence meant. He didn't believe me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window, listening to the house breathe, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind pressing against the glass. Every sound felt like a warning. By morning, I called Marla. My voice shook when I said, "We have to move the plan up." She didn't hesitate. "Then we do it tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word felt like salvation and danger all at once. That afternoon, I packed my suitcase carefully, folding only what mattered, my documents, a few clothes, the photo of Robert holding newborn David, and the old rosary my mother gave me before she died. Everything else would stay behind, like a shell I'd outgrown. David didn't come home that night. That alone was suspicious. He always made a point of returning, if only to remind me of his presence. When I asked Marla the next morning if she'd seen his car leave, she said yes, early, just after dawn. "Then this is it," she whispered. "We go now." I took one last look around the kitchen, the faded curtains, the chipped mug by the sink, the empty chair where I used to sit waiting for David to come home from school. Every corner was heavy with memories that no longer belonged to me. I left a letter on the dining table beneath a vase of half-wilted flowers. It wasn't a plea or an apology, it was the truth he'd never wanted to hear. "This house isn't yours. It never was. You took my kindness for weakness, but you were wrong. Everything you destroyed in this home can't be replaced by new walls or paint. When you read this, I'll be gone, not running from you, but choosing myself for the first time. A mother's presence is worth more than any money." I signed it simply, Helen Price. Then I closed the door behind me, firm and final. The morning air bit cold against my face, but it felt like freedom, raw and unfamiliar. Marla's car was waiting by the corner, engine running, her hands gripping the wheel. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, clutching my suitcase. More than ever. We drove off quietly, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a shape swallowed by the horizon. Neither of us spoke. Some silences are too sacred to break. But as Marla's car disappeared down the back road, I didn't know that David had already come home early, and the first thing his eyes found was the letter with my name on it. David came home earlier than usual that day. He parked the car in the driveway, his mind already filled with numbers, contracts, and his lawyer's reassuring words, "Don't worry, once the transfer is signed, everything will be yours." He didn't even notice the silence at first. The kind of silence that feels too neat, too deliberate. He walked in talking on his phone, tossing his keys on the counter. Yeah, we'll start renovations next week. Just need Mom to." His words stopped mid-sentence. The smell was wrong. The air was wrong. For years, the house had carried a faint scent of coffee and lavender soap, a lived-in comfort that he never acknowledged until now. But that day, the air was still. Dead. Empty. He called out, "Mom?" No answer. He tried again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the rooms. "Mom?" Nothing. Annoyance flickered first. He assumed she was in the garden or the laundry room. But when he went upstairs, the feeling shifted. Her bedroom door was open, wide open, something she never did. The bed was made neatly, the pillows arranged just so. There were no clothes scattered around, no signs of a recent presence. It was like she had been erased. David stood frozen at the doorway, confusion gnawing at his chest. Then, as he stepped back into the hallway, his eyes caught something on the dining table downstairs, a folded piece of paper under a glass vase. He walked toward it slowly, as if his body already knew it carried bad news. When he unfolded the letter, his eyes ran over the handwriting he had seen 1,000 times, small, precise, patient. As he read, his throat tightened. The words were calm, deliberate, merciless. "This house isn't yours. You took my kindness for weakness, but you were wrong. Everything you destroyed here can't be rebuilt. I'm not running from you. I'm choosing myself." By the time he reached the last line, "A mother's presence is worth more than any money," his hands were shaking. He crushed the paper in his fist, his pulse pounding so loud it drowned out the quiet. "You can't do this," he muttered, his voice cracking. "You have no right." He threw the letter onto the floor and kicked the vase off the table. It shattered against the wall, scattering petals and glass like confetti at a funeral. But no amount of shouting could fill the silence she'd left behind. He stormed upstairs, searching through drawers, closets, the attic, anywhere she might have hidden. He found nothing. Not even the small things he once ignored, her favorite necklace, her sewing kit, her diary. Gone. Then came the panic. He ran to the safe in the study, yanked it open, and found empty folders. The house deed was gone. So were the bank statements. For the first time in years, David felt something unfamiliar, fear. He sat down hard in the armchair, his chest rising and falling. The house seemed to mock him now. Every creak, every echo reminded him of her quiet footsteps, her soft humming, her patient voice. And now, without her, the place felt wrong. Soulless. He called her phone, once, twice, 10 times. Each time, the same message played, "The number you've dialed is not available." He called his lawyer next, demanding updates, but even Mr. Sterling couldn't help. "She hasn't signed anything, David," he said firmly. "Legally, everything still belongs to her. Without her signature, you have no claim." David's grip tightened on the phone. Then find her. But deep down, he knew, she didn't want to be found. That night, he sat alone in the dark living room, surrounded by pieces of the shattered vase. The letter lay open at his feet, her handwriting glowing faintly in the moonlight. For the first time since childhood, David cried, quietly, bitterly, like a man realizing the one person who loved him without condition was gone for good. But while David drowned in guilt and rage, Helen was miles away, and for the first time in decades, she was breathing freely, unaware that her son's obsession to find her was only just beginning. The car ride felt endless, and yet, I wished it would never stop. The further we drove, the lighter I felt, as if every mile peeled off another layer of fear I'd worn for years. Marla kept both hands on the steering wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead. The hum of the tires against the asphalt became a kind of music, one that spoke of escape, of second chances. Neither of us said much. Some silences are sacred, and this one was. When we finally crossed into North Carolina, the sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in copper and rose. I rolled down the window and felt the cold air whip against my face. It smelled of pine, rain, and something else, something I hadn't tasted in decades. Freedom. Marla glanced at me and smiled softly. You're quiet. I'm listening, I said. To what? To the sound of not belonging to anyone. She chuckled gently, and that laugh, warm, genuine, unhurried, wrapped around me like a blanket. It was nearly dark when we reached her cousin's house just outside Asheville. A small, one-story cottage sat at the edge of a wooded hill, with a porch light glowing like a welcome home sign from the universe. It wasn't grand, but it was safe. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and lemon. The floor creaked under my shoes, and sunlight still lingered on the curtains. Everything was quiet, beautifully quiet. Marla helped me set down my suitcase, then looked at me as if waiting for something. I didn't realize she was watching for my reaction until she asked, "Well? What do you think?" I looked around slowly, taking in every detail, the worn sofa, the faded rug, the chipped teacup sitting by the window. "It's perfect," I whispered. "It doesn't remember me." Marla understood exactly what I meant. After she left that night, I sat by the window in the little living room, a blanket around my shoulders, staring into the dark woods. I didn't feel scared, just unfamiliar with peace. I had spent so long surviving that I'd forgotten how to simply exist. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, waiting for the usual sounds, David's footsteps, the clatter of dishes, the sting of silence between us. None came. The night was still. The stillness was mine. That first morning, I woke to birdsong instead of arguments. I brewed coffee in a small pot Marla had left on the counter, and when I took the first sip, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because the taste of it reminded me what life used to feel like before fear made everything bitter. Days passed slowly. I took walks around the quiet town, sometimes stopping at the market where no one knew my name. I watched people laugh, argue, live, without pretending. No one looked at me as a burden or a responsibility. And yet, peace had its own kind of loneliness. At night, when the wind brushed against the windows, I'd sometimes hear echoes of David's voice, sharp, impatient, ungrateful, and a part of me ached. Not for his love, but for the illusion I once believed in. Marla came by often, never staying long, but always checking in. She brought groceries, books, and sometimes just her presence. She'd sit on the porch with me, both of us sipping coffee in comfortable silence. One afternoon, as we watched the clouds drift above the hills, she said, "You know, Helen, sometimes peace is louder than chaos. You just have to get used to the sound." I smiled faintly. I'm learning. But even as I learned to breathe again, part of me couldn't escape the feeling that the past wasn't finished with me, and somewhere, far behind, David was beginning to look for me. The woman he underestimated was being reborn from the ashes he left behind. But peace is never guaranteed, and when a letter arrived at my door with no return address, written in handwriting I knew too well, I realized the past had finally found me. It came on a Thursday morning, tucked neatly between a grocery flyer and an electric bill. The envelope was plain, white, and trembling slightly in my hands as if it carried a heartbeat. There was no name, no return address, just my new one written carefully across the front. But the handwriting was enough. David. For a long time I couldn't move. I stood by the mailbox, staring at it, as the morning breeze rustled the trees behind me. My first instinct was to throw it away, to protect the fragile piece I'd built. But curiosity, or maybe love in disguise, made me take it inside. I set the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it over a cooling cup of tea. The air felt heavier with every passing minute. My hands didn't shake, not anymore, but my heart did. Finally, I opened it. The first line was a knife. I don't know where you are, and that's driving me insane. His handwriting, once neat and confident, was uneven, frantic. The words tumbled across the page as if written in anger or desperation, maybe both. I'd been searching everywhere. I thought I'd find you within days, but you've disappeared. Do you hate me that much? I paused, feeling the sting of old wounds reopening. Hate wasn't the word. I never hated him. I pitied what he'd become. You left me with nothing but questions. I walk through the house and it's like you never existed, but everything still smells like you. I can't sleep. I can't think. I keep hearing your voice. I could almost see him, pacing through those hollow rooms, haunted by the silence he once created. Then the letter shifted, the rage softening into something that almost sounded like sorrow. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I was scared of losing control. You were the only person who ever made me feel safe, and I didn't know how to live without that. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just didn't know another way to keep you close. Tears blurred my vision. I wasn't sure if they came from sadness or disbelief. He had written keep you close as if control and love were the same thing, the way a drowning man clings to someone just to stay afloat, not realizing he's pulling them under. The last line broke me. Please come home, Mom. We can fix this. Home. The word felt foreign now. That house had been my cage, my grave while I was still breathing. And yet, a part of me, the mother part, ached. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat with trembling fingers, and placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat at the table, staring at the window, watching dust swirl in the sunlight. Marla came by later that afternoon and found me still there. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said gently. I have, I whispered, sliding the letter toward her. She read it in silence, then exhaled slowly. He's not asking for forgiveness. He's asking for control again. I nodded. And that's exactly why I can't go back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world outside was calm, the hum of cicadas, the rustle of trees, the rhythm of a quiet life I'd fought for. Finally, I took the letter, walked to the fireplace, and set it inside. The paper curled and blackened, the ink dissolving into smoke. When it was gone, I whispered, "Goodbye, David," and felt something inside me settle, not peace, not closure, but release. But I didn't know that burning that letter wasn't the end, because somewhere far away, David had already decided that if I wouldn't come home, he would come to me. The night I burned the letter, I slept more soundly than I had in months. For the first time, I didn't dream of David's voice or the house that once held me captive. I dreamed of water, clear, endless, forgiving. When I woke, sunlight poured through the window, and for a fleeting moment, I believed that chapter of my life had truly ended. But peace has a strange way of warning us when it's about to leave. The next morning, while walking to the market, I felt it, that faint, unsettling pull in my chest. A shift in the air. Something invisible, yet familiar, brushing against my senses like a cold hand. Marla noticed it too. You've been quiet today, she said, eyeing me as we walked down the gravel road. Just tired, I lied. But deep down, I wasn't tired, I was alert. Watching. Waiting. Because sometimes, even before danger arrives, the heart recognizes its footsteps. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, David was packing a suitcase. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The bags beneath his eyes were dark, his hands unsteady. But there was a feverish determination in him, a conviction that finding me was the only way to make sense of the emptiness he'd created. He'd read and reread the burned edges of his letter, what little remained of it when the post office returned fragments of unsent mail due to smudged ink. Somehow, he convinced himself I'd written back, that I still loved him enough to forgive him. He sold his car, rented another one under a friend's name, and began driving south, following leads that barely existed. He stopped at diners, gas stations, even small motels, showing my photo to strangers. "Have you seen this woman?" Late 60s, gray hair, kind eyes. Most shook their heads. Some didn't even look. But David didn't stop. Guilt had transformed into obsession. By the time he reached the North Carolina border, his sanity was hanging by threads. He muttered to himself as he drove, convincing himself that when he found me, everything would be okay again. He'd apologize, I'd cry, and we'd rebuild what he'd broken. Except what he didn't understand was that the woman he remembered, the silent, obedient, forgiving mother, no longer existed. Back in Asheville, I was learning to live as the new Helen. I'd started volunteering at the local library, helping children pick books after school. Their laughter filled the quiet spaces of my heart, the ones David had left hollow. One afternoon, while shelving books, I caught my reflection in the window, smiling, vibrant, unafraid. I barely recognized her. And that made me proud. Still, that feeling, that faint hum of unease, lingered. I found myself double-checking locks at night. Once, I even thought I saw a car parked too long near the cottage, headlights off, engine idling. When I stepped outside, it was gone. Marla brushed it off as nerves, but she didn't see how my hands trembled slightly when I poured tea, or how I slept with the lamp on again. Then one evening, as I stood on the porch watering the ivy plant, I noticed an envelope slipped under the gate. It was blank. No address, no stamp. My stomach turned cold. I didn't need to open it to know. I recognized the uneven handwriting immediately, the same shaky scrawl that had begged, "Please come home." Inside, there were only 5 words. "You can't hide forever, Mom." The world tilted for a moment. The watering slipped from my hand, water spilling across the porch boards. And as I looked out toward the quiet road beyond the trees, I saw headlights flash once, brief, deliberate, and I knew, David had found me. The night he found me, the air outside was too still. Even the cicadas seemed to sense it, their song fell silent, leaving the world suspended between 2 heartbeats. I stood frozen on the porch, the letter still clutched in my trembling hand. Down the road, a pair of headlights cut through the dark like watchful eyes. The car moved slowly, deliberately, until it stopped just short of the gate. The door opened. He stepped out. David. Older, thinner, unshaven. The sharp lines of arrogance had faded from his face, replaced by exhaustion and something deeper, desperation. His suit was wrinkled, his tie gone. His eyes searched the porch like a man chasing ghosts. When he saw me, he didn't speak. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, mother and son, separated not by distance, but by years of silence and wounds that never healed. Finally, he whispered, "You really left." I swallowed hard. "I did." "Why?" His voice cracked like a child's. "Why couldn't we fix it?" I stepped down from the porch slowly, my bare feet brushing against the cold dirt. "Because I spent half my life fixing what you broke, David. And the other half trying to forgive you for it." He flinched, as if the words were physical blows. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know." My voice softened. "But meaning and doing aren't the same thing." He took a step closer, his eyes glistening in the dim porch light. "I lost everything after you left. The house, the money, it all fell apart. I thought if I found you, maybe it could all make sense again." I shook my head gently. "I'm not the piece that fits your broken puzzle anymore." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of crickets returning to life. David's shoulders sagged, the fight slowly leaving him. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, like the little boy who used to run to me after scraping his knees, asking me to make it better. I wanted to reach out, to pull him close, to promise him safety like I once did. But some love, when twisted too far, becomes something else, and I couldn't go back to that place again. Instead, I said softly, "You need help, David. Real help. Not from me, from someone who can teach you how to live without hurting others." He blinked, confusion and pain colliding behind his eyes. "So that's it? You just walk away?" "No," I said quietly. "I finally stopped letting you walk over me." He looked at me one last time, tears shining under the streetlight. Then, without a word, he turned, walked back to the car, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the night until there was nothing left, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the steady beat of my own heart. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence fill the spaces his absence left behind. It wasn't grief this time. It was relief. When I finally went back inside, Marla was waiting by the window, worry etched across her face. "Is he gone?" she asked. I nodded. "For good, I think." She exhaled shakily. "And how do you feel?" I looked around at the small cottage, the warm lamplight, the ivy by the window, the faint scent of tea and rain. For the first time, it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like home. "I feel like I can breathe," I said softly. "And this time, I'm breathing for me." Marla smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then you're finally free, Helen." I stepped to the door and looked out into the night, where the darkness no longer frightened me. I whispered to the wind, not for him, but for myself. "Goodbye, David. And thank you, for teaching me what freedom costs." The stars above seemed to shimmer brighter, and somewhere deep inside me, peace, real peace, finally took root. Sometimes, freedom doesn't come with a grand escape. It comes in quiet moments, when you finally choose yourself after years of choosing everyone else. Helen's story reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, rebuild your peace, and walk away from what no longer loves you right. If this story touched your heart, broken heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories just like this one. And remember, every ending isn't a loss. Sometimes, it's the beginning of who you were meant to be.